Today I'm reading from the Visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, Book 1. This is going to be about the Virgin Mary. Now, before I get to that, I will say this one thing. When contrasting the books between Anne Catherine Emmerich, her writings, and Mary of Agreda, Anne Catherine Emmerich focuses on basically history and prophecy. Mystical City of God is a look into the mystical aspects of the Virgin Mary. Now, what I'm reading to you is going to be more physical, more material than it is mystical. This is something we have to understand in the contrast between these two books and what we have to take from it. These two series of volumes, I should say, because they're pretty extensive reads. So, without further ado, I will get into it. The Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was the second daughter of Anne and Joachim. She was always composed, serious, and deeply inward. She was attuned to everything connected with Jesus and the community of disciples, and also the community of holy women. She carried the whole of in her heart. Her love was boundless and her wisdom unfathomable. Mary Magdalene was taller and more beautiful than the other holy women, including even the beautiful Dina, the Samaritan. But the Virgin Mary was the most beautiful of all. Although the beauty of her form was not unmatched by others, and in some respects Magdalene's beauty was even more striking, Mary stands out among them all, more especially through an indescribable silent blessing that emanated from her, and through her simplicity, meekness, youthfulness, earnestness, and purity. Mary was always composed, serious, and deeply inward. She was purity itself, so lacking in any extraneous qualities that she seemed no more nor less than the reflection of God in a human being. No other is like her in this respect except for her Son. She, like her Son, was in the image and likeness of God, the one expressing the feminine side of God, and the other the masculine side. Exalted beyond all others, she was at the same time the most humble of human beings, completely guileless like an innocent child. In terms of physical appearance, Mary was slender, tall, and ever youthful. She had a high forehead, a long, well-proportioned nose, large eyes, usually cast down, a beautiful red mouth, and pleasantly tanned skin with shimmering rosy cheeks. She was serious, quiet, and often sad, but never over-distraught. When she wept, her tears ran gently across her exquisitely peaceful face. Everyone who beheld her saw that she was beyond all other women in her unspeakable purity, innocence, and wisdom. Peaceful serenity and loving kindness emanated from her gaze as a blessing toward all human beings with whom she came into connection. During the three, and this is Mary's permanent residence, this is subtitled. During the 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry, Mary resided with her maid in the house she had moved to after Joseph's death, located between Capernaum and Bethsaida at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. It belonged to the wealthy Levi, who lived in a large house nearby. Peter's family had leased it from Levi and put it at the disposal of Jesus and Mary. The house was roomy and included several outbuildings where occasional visitors would stay, including Mary's relatives and friends. most of whom came from Nazareth, Sepphoris, and Jerusalem, and later the disciples of Jesus. The house was ideally suited for this purpose. It was to this house that Jesus returned again and again from his teaching and healing journeys throughout Palestine. Mary also often traveled on these journeys in the company of some of the holy women in order to be present at the teachings of her son. Mary did not maintain her own household and possessed neither fields nor cattle of her own. She lived as a widow from the gifts of friends and relatives, especially those from Sepphoris. Levi's servants stopped by regularly, bringing food from Capernaum, looking after the house and garden, and house sitting when Mary was away. Mary occupied herself with sewing, spinning, and crocheting. She prayed much and converted and taught other women. There were almost always guests in the house, so much so that often she had no room even for additional visitors who traveled the long distance there from Nazareth or Jerusalem. Jesus' comportment with his mother. This is the subtitle. Even at home, Mary was not spared many a stress and strain. It started with all manner of gossip from neighbors, whereby, under the guise of consoling her, they accused Jesus of living the life of a vagrant, telling her that he was neglecting her and that it should be his first concern to learn a trade in order to support her, now that Joseph was dead. Whether for or against him, people throughout the land were constantly talking about Jesus. Jesus was very poised and inwardly restrained, but even so, not free of some inner agitations, premonitions, and anxiety whenever her son was away. Every vile rumor his enemies let loose was reported to her, just as all the fears and worries of his well-meaning acquaintances came also to her ear. As a result, she often waited with fearful longing for his return. Jesus' behavior toward Mary was ever loving and respectful. Whenever they met, he extended to her both his hands, and if she knelt before him to kiss them, she kissed hers in embrace when she arose. When they were alone, he often embraced her consolingly. When he was teaching, she treated him as a saint and prophet. She never embraced him, but extended her hand when he offered his. Jesus put recent converts under Mary's wing. For instance, Dinah, the Samaritan woman, Mara, the Suphanite, and Mary Magdalene. He introduced all the apostles and disciples to her personally, and whenever he returned to Capernaum, hers was always the first house he visited. There was an unspoken covenant between the two, that Mary take the disciples into her heart, her prayers, and her blessing, to some extent even into her very self as her children and as siblings to Jesus. She was their spiritual mother, even as she was the actual mother of Jesus in the flesh. She fulfilled this agreement always to her utmost and in the most intimate fashion, and Jesus also accorded this covenant great solemnity. There was, in its fulfillment, something inexpressibly holy, a deep interiority. For Mary was as the rootstock and fruiting vine of the flesh and blood of Jesus. Subtitle: Mary's Wisdom. At the high point of Jesus' teaching activity, at the time of the great crowds that came to hear him speak at Capernaum in early AD 30, when the great mountain sermons began, Mary attended all his sermons. For although she had prior awareness of the mysteries he revealed, as yet she had not fully understood them. For instance, how the second person of the divinity was received by her body and there became flesh both as her child and as divine humanity. All these deep knowings were embraced within her humble and respectful motherly love for Jesus. But when, much to the fury of the deluded, Jesus taught more openly the secrets of his origin, his earthly mission, and his approaching return to the Father, Mary's attention was recalled to these mysteries. After one such teaching, while at prayer in her lodgings later that evening, Mary had an intellectual vision of the angel's salutation, the birth and childhood of Jesus, the reality of her motherhood, and of his truly being a child. And she consciously assimilated the fact that she bore and raised her own child, he who is the Son of God. She was so overcome with awe that she dissolved into tears. And yet these revelations were cloaked still in her feeling of motherly love for her divine Son, just as in the sacrament the form of the bread cloaks the living God. Subtext: some aspects of Mary's behavior. Altogether, Mary was indescribably simple in nature. Jesus never let on before others that she was an especial worthy person. She never herself involved herself with any but the sick and unlearned. She appeared always earnest and unutterably honest. All respected her, even her son's enemies, although she sought no one out and always maintained her reserve. The only time she stepped forward was at the head of the procession when Jesus made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. At the gathering in Judah, immediately after the Baptist's beheading, as those present visited his birth room, Mary showed them a large blanket covered with embroidered sayings of the prophets and recounted the circumstances of her making that blanket with Elizabeth. She told of having prophesied to Elizabeth that John would see Jesus only 3 times and noted that this indeed proved true. At this point, Jesus spoke up and, after carefully introducing the subject, told the story of the decapitation. And in consequence, the blanket was drenched in the mourner's tears. At the Great Mountain Sermons of October AD 30, Mary took charge of the care of the sick among the women and children, as well as the distribution of charitable gifts to the poor. With her friends and the disciples, she oversaw the practical accomplishment of these things. Afterwards, she and her friends continued their work, making blankets, clothing, sandals, and belts, preparing food stocks, baking bread, all for the poor, and visiting the sick. Throughout all of this activity, she remained uncommonly silent, simpler and more serious than the others. She also visited Judas Iscariot to caution him, for he had shown himself to be envious and avaricious. On one occasion, she wept over him. He was moved and repeatedly tried to change his ways, but always fell back. While Jesus taught at the last community meal before the Passion, Mary wept at the women's table as she carved the lamb. Mary's death and assumption subtext. About 1 year after the crucifixion, Jesus was stoned, and the rising settlement of new converts around Jerusalem was dissolved. The Christians dispersed and some murdered. A few years later, a new storm rose against them. Then it was that Mary, who until that time had dwelt in a small house near the cenacle and in Bethany, allowed herself to be conducted by John to the region of Ephesus, where the Christians had already made settlements. This happened a short time after the imprisonment of Lazarus and his sisters by the Jews and their setting out over the sea. Mary's dwelling was not in Ephesus itself, but from 3 to 4 hours distant. It stood on a height upon which several Christians from Judea, among them some of the holy women related to her, had taken up their abode. In the neighborhood of her dwelling, the Blessed Mary had herself erected the stations of the Holy Way of the Cross. Though by now very advanced in years, Mary had in her appearance no other mark of age than that of great longing, which at length effectuated her glorification. She was inexpressibly grave. The older she grew, the whiter and more transparent became her face. She was thin, but with no wrinkle, no sign of decay in her. She was like a spirit. After Mary had lived 3 years in the settlement near Ephesus, she conceived a great desire to visit Jerusalem, so John and Peter escorted her thither. Several apostles were assembled there, and Mary assisted them with her advice. On her arrival, before she entered the city, she visited the Mount of Olives, Mount Golgotha, the Holy Sepulchre, and all the holy places around Jerusalem. Mary was so sad, so moved by compassion that she could scarcely walk. Peter and John supported her under the arms. A year and a half before her death, she made one more journey from Ephesus to Jerusalem, where she again visited the holy places, where she came to the back gate of that palace where she had first seen Jesus passing with his cross, where he fell. She was so agitated by the painful remembrance that she too sank into the ground. Her companions thought she was dying. As Mary felt her end approaching, in accordance with the directions of her divine Son, she called the apostles to her by prayer. She was now in her 64th year. Okay, I'll do a subnote, a lot of them anyways. When the apostles went all together into Mary's little sleeping chamber in order to take leave of her, the disciples and holy women remained standing in the front apartment. Mary sat upright, and as the apostles knelt in turn at the side of her couch, she prayed over each and blessed him with her hands laid upon him crosswise. She did the same to the disciples and to the women. Mary then addressed them in a body and did all that Jesus had in Bethany directed her to do. Peter then celebrated the Holy Mass in the Virgin's own oratory. Mary was in a sitting posture on her couch during the whole celebration. Peter first gave the Blessed Virgin the last anointing, just as that sacrament is administered at the present day. That's the Holy Unction. Next, he administered Holy Communion, which she received sitting up without support. Then she sank back down onto her pillow, and after the apostles had offered a short prayer, she received the chalice from John, but not now in so upright a posture. After communion, Mary spoke no more. Her countenance, blooming and smiling as in youth, was raised above. The roof of her chamber was no longer visible, and a lamp appeared to be suspended in open air. A pathway of light arose from Mary up to the heavenly Jerusalem, up to the throne of the Most Holy Trinity. On either side of the pathway were clouds of light, out of which gazed angelic faces. Mary raised her arms to the heavenly Jerusalem. Her body with all its wrappings was floating high above the couch. A figure of light, also with upraised arms, appeared to issue from Mary. The two choirs of angels united under this figure and soared up with it, as if separating it from the body, which now sank back down upon the couch, the hands crossed upon the breast. Many holy souls, among them Joseph Anne, Joachim, John the Baptist, Zachariah, and Elizabeth, came to meet her, but up she soared, followed by them to her son, whose wounds were flashing light, far more brilliant than that which surrounded him. He received her and placed in her hand a scepter, pointing at the same time over the whole circumference of the earth. At last a multitude of souls was released from purgatory and soared up to heaven. On the night following the burial, there took place the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin into heaven, which Anne Catherine describes thus. I saw on this night several of the apostles and holy women in the little garden, praying and singing psalms before the grotto. I saw a broad pathway of light descend from heaven and rest upon the tomb. In it were circles of glory full of angels, in the midst of whom the resplendent soul of the Blessed Virgin came floating down. Before her went her divine Son, the marks of his wounds flashing with light. In her innermost circle, that which surrounded the holy soul of Mary, the angels appeared like the faces of very young children. In the second circle, they were like those of children from 6 to 8 years old. In the outermost, like the faces of youths. I could clearly distinguish only the face, the rest of the figure consisting of perfectly transparent light. Encircling the head of the Blessed Virgin like a crown was a choir of blessed spirits. I know not what the presence saw of all this, but I saw that some gazed up in amazement and adoration, while others cast themselves prostrate in fright upon the earth. These apparitions, becoming more and more distinct as they approached nearer, floated over the grotto, and another pathway of light issued from it and arose to the heavenly Jerusalem. The blessed soul of Mary, floating before Jesus, penetrated through the rock and into the tomb, out of which she again rose radiant with light in her glorified body, and, escorted by the entire multitude of celestial spirits, returned in triumph to the heavenly Jerusalem. The Assumption of the Blessed Mary took place on August 15th, AD 44. Okay, so that's the reading, but I assembled quite a few notes, and this is the good stuff, okay? So stick around. First point. I won't be numbering these points because I didn't number them in my notes. So, I won't be reading all of what they call the dramatis personae until they become relevant when I'm reading through the Advent. I gave us Peter, John, James, Andrew, and Mary, who besides St. Joseph were probably the closest to Christ, though Mary is an uncontested number one. As Father Chad Ripperger put it, and this was finely put, if God had to choose between Mary and all the rest of creation, he'd pick Mary. That's how important Mary is. So, just a second. Something here. Oh, yes. Okay. What I'm going to be doing this week is, before I start the Adam and Eve story, I'm going to have 2 more videos talking about Jesus's adversaries. So, anyways, let's get going. Next point. Okay, her given appearance. It does not conflict with Mystical City of God. In Mystical City of God, she's also described as taller than most women of the day, which I assume were a little taller than 5 feet. I know St. Anne was supposedly pretty short. I think she would have been about 5'9", where Jesus would have been just about 5'11". Anyways, I decided instead of trying to draw this from memory, I'm just going to look up the passage. So, Mystical City of God, Volume 2, number 115. The bodily shape of the heavenly queen was well proportioned and taller than is usual with other maidens of her age, yet extremely elegant and perfect in all its parts. Her face was rather more oblong than round, gracious and beautiful, without leanness or grossness. Its complexion clear, yet of a slightly brownish hue. Her forehead spacious, yet symmetrical, her eyebrows perfectly arched, her eyes large and serious, of incredible and ineffable beauty and dove-like sweetness, dark in color, with a mixture tending towards green. Her nose straight and well shaped, her mouth small with red-colored lips, neither too thin nor too thick. All the gifts of nature in her were so symmetrical and beautiful that no other human being ever had the like. To look upon her caused feelings at the same time of joy and seriousness, love and reverential fear. She attracted the heart and yet restrained it with sweet reverence. Now, you'll notice that they both use serious, serious, serious. It seems to be one of the more important adjectives when describing the countenance of Our Lady. So she probably was never seen guffawing or laughing or anything like that. But if she smiled, it probably would have been a tender smile of contentment rather than the la la la. Anyways, next point. And I got a few more of these. Mystical City of God extends a lot of her traits as well. For example, Mary and Jesus, according to Mystical City, were made and designed in the image of Adam and Eve. Like Jesus is the clone of Adam and Mary is the clone of the woman who became Eve. It gives new meaning to the saying that they were the new Adam and Eve. When Jesus calls Mary woman in the Gospel of John, you can actually link that with Genesis 2. Adam called Eve woman before she had fallen in her nature and became under his dominion. And then he renamed her Eve because she was fallen and now was under his dominion. See, naming in Genesis 2, Adam named the creatures that were inferior to him. So Eve had become inferior to him, so he named her Eve. But since Our Lady was immaculately conceived, perhaps Jesus always called her woman because Mary was never fallen. And although she always treated him in a superior manner, Jesus always kind of referred her as flesh of her flesh and bone of her bones kind of thing. Except he was extracted from her, whereas Eve was extracted from Adam. And in Mystical City, he was extracted from three drops of blood from her heart that secreted into her uterus. So, fascinating stuff. Anyways, next point. Anne Catherine describes her eyes as being downcast. Mystical City doubles this. She's described as in Mystical City as never making eye contact with anyone except for God, i.e. her son in Mystical City. She didn't even look at angels but to notice they were there. It's to say that she had that powerful of a singular devotion for God. Her eyes were only for God. Next point. I understand this stuff is exceedingly reverential. When we humans look upon a light so bright it blinds us. Lucifer wanted to be that light, but he could never be her. So in envy, he hated her and wants to silence relevance to her. This is why we see him going after her in Revelation 12. If anyone ever goes after her, they are likewise being blinded by her perfection. Because when we see her perfection, we get a much bigger glimpse of our own imperfections. And those may be rather ugly to look at, and some people might not want to see their ugliness, their own ugliness. They're that proud, they're that narcissistic. Some people don't want to live a life in constant pursuit of perfection, but then those people can never truly say that they are Christian until they pursue perfection, because Christ told us to pursue perfection in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5. Next point. In Mystical City, it was said that Joseph died around 27 or 28 AD, but it never mentions his house between Bethsaida and Capernaum. So the stay at this house is provided by Levi. I don't think to be confused with Levi, the disciple, and probably an older guy. I haven't come across him yet. Anyways, it would likely have been for 3 or 4 years tops, because I think they based in Jerusalem or near where Lazarus lived, and in Jerusalem, and then after that she went to Ephesus. Okay, next point. Mary considered it the greatest honor to do even the most mundane duties, not only for Christ but for her husband Joseph when he was alive. So we see this reflected in nuns, that is, traditional nuns. I don't know about the new ones that don't wear habits. Anyways, next point. In Mystical City, Mary was given infused knowledge that would have made us look like amoeba, even St. John Bosco. But she didn't know everything. She herself was given to contemplate mysteries. And this is why contemplating mysteries is extremely important to the Christian. Next point. In Mystical City, the timeline is she was born around 15 BC, married Joseph on her 15th birthday, but Christ gave birth to Christ shortly after, then lived around 55 AD and died in her 70th year. According to Anne Catherine, this is a discrepancy. She dies at 44 AD instead. The assumption was slightly different, but Peter said Mass at both instances, I believe, and she was doing the math, she'd have been around 20 at the Nativity of Christ if she had died around 64 years old. Next point. Again, I don't care about these discrepancies. To me, they measure our faith. We live in something of a pseudo-reality where God is real and everything is less real than God. So it doesn't matter to me if small details are mixed. It means to me not that I don't believe one or the other, but that I hold both accounts in suspension. Of course, they're history. You should never hold history as fact, but only in suspension. Unfortunately, we want to hold history as fact, but it's hard to do because it can get layered and each layer can overwrite what was on the layer before it. So we have no choice but to hold it in suspension. We're lucky to have these mystics tell us these things. Anyways, what we do is profit from the information without having to argue the particulars. They should be pointed out nevertheless, because this is a test of faith for all of us. Next point. In Mystical City of God, Mary did not have an older sister. According to Mary of Agreda's work, Anne and Joachim married when Anne was 22 and Joachim was 44. And she only gave birth to Mary in her 40s, having been barren basically the whole time. And Catherine introduces new people we didn't know existed. According to Mary of Agreda, Joachim died very shortly after Mary was taken into the temple at the age of 3. St. Anne only outlived her husband, according to Agreda, Mary of Agreda, by a few years. But St. Anne was much younger than he was, 22 years apparently. So I think Mary would have been around 8 years old when St. Anne had died, according to Mary of Agreda. Next point. And I know, before I get into that, I know Maria Valtorta's visions have something different entirely. She has Anne basically living past Mary's time in the temple. So We don't know. We don't know. Next point. Mary's aging, rather, lack of it. Both books, that is, between Mystical City of God and Anne Catherine's visions, say basically the same thing, though Anne Catherine goes into detail about what she looked like a little bit more later on. When we get to Adam and Woman in Anne Catherine's visions, we're going to see humans in a very different way, part luminous. This began happening to Mary. She was getting luminous and her hair was turning white, but she wasn't wrinkling, according to Anne Catherine. Now, according to Mary of Agreda, Mary never aged a day past 33 years old, which when we look at Christ movies and shows, they always make Mary pretty old. Some of them make her look like a wrinkly old grandmother. I don't know why. But anyways, this is an error. An error in the shows, not an error in the text. Theologically, the texts are actually correct. Aging and mortality are the result of the punishment of original sin in Genesis 3. But Mary and Jesus were both immaculately conceived and had no sin. Therefore, they matured to fullness and never aged a day beyond that, except Jesus died at 33, so we never have known it, would have known it. And Mary died, apparently did age to 64 in Anne Catherine's visions. You never looked older than 33, only matured in a particular way. Technically, they were immortal in terms of aging. Now, last point. Our Lady has a title, Queen of Martyrs. We have to fully understand the meaning of this because Jesus and Mary were technically only mortal in that you could kill their bodies and if you were permitted to. They both had an incredible constitution, one we could not even fathom. Mary of Agreda gives us a taste of this. Basically, constitution saying that they fully absorbed everything they ate with no going to the bathroom, and that they both basically never perspired other than, of course, the sweating of blood. When Jesus and Mary suffered, they did so with far greater acuity than we did. That is not to say that they were invincible mechs, but rather even more sensitive than we are. And so when Mary revisits Jerusalem, according to Anne Catherine, we see how wounded she is when she revisits those places of Christ's crucifixion. We have no idea how much she suffered because we will never have any account of her constitution other than what's been told us. Nobody has it. So the fact that she's a Queen of Martyrs is an earned title. I went over this specifically in one of the videos I made, one of the reports to the Chancellor, reports to the Great Monarch. Anyway, that's it. Ave Maria.